Protesters take to the streets of Romania, just the latest European citizens to feel the pinch of austerity measures. Romania's fiscal squeeze is largely being driven by the International Monetary Fund. But is economic austerity the correct prescription? And should the IMF have the power to impose it? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Taimur Nabili. An international mission is visiting Romania to review its loan deal. This as anti-government protesters clash with police in anger at economic conditions. Despite job and wage cuts and a tax hike, Romania had, until now, avoided the type of violent street protests seen in Greece and other European states. But now Romania's Prime Minister has warned anti-government protesters that more violence will not be tolerated. Nick Spicer reports from Bucharest.
The wave of discontent rippling across Europe has reached some 40 cities and towns in Romania. On Sunday night, rock throwers, police said, were football hooligans, disrupted the otherwise peaceful demonstration in the capital, injuring some 60 people. On Monday, the Prime Minister said the right to assembly would be respected, but police were going to stop anything else.
Niciun fel de violență stradală nu este tolerată.
Street violence will not be tolerated, but peaceful demonstrations are acceptable. I understand people are suffering, but their problems can't be fixed overnight.
But the demonstrators are tired of waiting.
Yesterday they were a little bit violent. I don't know where did it start, but we don't want violence, we only want change.
We are a fighting people. We are going to fight for our freedom and for our rights forever. We'll stay here until they go.
This is the man they most want to go, President Traian Băsescu, who has considerable powers under the Constitution. He was long popular with many Romanians, seen as a man of the people. No more.
It's been a long time since Romanians took to the streets like this, and even though their numbers are not massive, there is a definite whiff of people power in the air. The list of grievances may be long, and there may be no visible leader, but there is a man who sparked it all off.
Rad Arafat, a respected emergency room doctor from Palestine originally, quit his cabinet job running the country's emergency medicine. He wanted to protest over a plan to partially privatize the ambulance service. Arafat set up the first such service in post-communist Romania, initially using his own car. The government reversed course, but it was too late. Arafat's gesture appears to have mobilized a public often described as disillusioned and tired of politics. Nick Spicer for Inside Story, Bucharest.
Well, let's give you a little background on the situation in Romania in the run-up to these riots. Now, before the global economic recession, Romania enjoyed almost a decade of steady economic growth. Strong demand from EU markets and domestic consumption and investment fueled GDP growth. But it also caused a widening budget deficit. And then, in the last quarter of 2008, the country really began to feel the effects of the global downturn. In 2009, its GDP fell more than 7%, prompting the government to ask for an emergency loan from international lenders. In 2010, with the country on the verge of bankruptcy, the International Monetary Fund, the European Commission and the World Bank all granted a loan of some 20 billion euros. But there were conditions. Drastic austerity measures were part of that loan agreement. Another 1.9% contraction in GDP followed in that year. And then in 2011, we saw a modest return to growth. GDP was up by 1.9% in the third quarter, which was the highest quarterly number in the EU. So, is the IMF helping or hindering Romania's financial stability? To answer this question, I'm joined in Bucharest by Adrian Ion. He's the publisher of the magazine The Diplomat. In Brussels, Piotr Kaczynski is a research fellow at the Centre for European Policy Studies. And in Skopje, Sam Vaknin is the editor-in-chief of the online news service The Politician. He's also been an advisor to several Eastern European governments. Gentlemen, thank you all indeed for being with us today. Adrian, in Bucharest, let me begin with you, if I might. Just to sum up the conditions on the streets at the moment and tell us, are these riots to be taken in the same sort of manner as what we've been seeing elsewhere in Europe?
I don't really think so, and to be honest, I personally believe that the momentum has passed. There are still a few hundred people at the moment in the University Square, but I don't think that the riots will spread or they will become at a national level like you might have seen in Greece or other countries. I think, like I said, the momentum has passed.
What makes you think that they might have run out of steam? Because the economic conditions, clearly, as we've sort of outlined, are pretty grim. And certainly, if Europe continues on the path that it's on, Romania's major market is in serious trouble. So that's not going to help Romania's own domestic economy, is it?
Well, it depends who you compare Romania with. If you compare it to some of the neighboring countries, I would say that Romania is a stable country. If you look at the macroeconomic figures for 2012 estimations, again, Romania is in a pretty good shape, I would say. And the main concern of the government is to keep the country stable, which it has. And I don't think that there are any reasons for a real concern that Romania might slip into a difficult economic crisis more than it is already.
Okay, let's go to Piotr Kuczynski. For your opinion, do you concur?
Well, it seems that way. I mean, the news came that the conflict that was at the bottom line of this current situation between the former State Secretary for Health, responsible for health reforms, has made some compromise with the President on comeback to the government. So in this particular case, the situation might be a little bit more stable now. But, and as always, every local conflict has its own context, but it doesn't change the situation where in the streets of Bucharest, what we saw over the last days, looks at least similarly to what we've seen in other places in Europe over the last months.
And what do you think of the broader prescription for the economy in Romania? Do you think, as Adrian was trying to suggest, that the worst is over, or do you think the ongoing problems of Europe are bound to have some kind of knock-on effect in Romania?
Well, it's difficult to say if the worst is over, because what we've seen is that an of secondary importance issue triggers massive protests, and then they can run out of steam within days. So we do not know exactly what's going on in the sense of how stable the situation will be. My sort of outside perspective would be rather that Romania is a stable country and it's probably more peaceful than neighboring Hungary, for example, or a little bit more to the south, Greece. However, everywhere in Europe, including Western Europe and Eastern Europe, Northern and Southern, Europe is boiling to some extent, and there are social pressures on societies in Europe that cause eruptions, sometimes very short eruptions, like we just saw in Bucharest.
Sam Vaknin, let me come to you and suggest that perhaps maybe the behavior of the citizens on the streets is not necessarily the biggest issue here. The biggest issue is still the state of the economy, not only in Romania, but across the whole of Europe, and how the economic situation is being handled by the powers that be. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think the IMF's involvement in Eastern and Central Europe raises 4 issues, and I'll try to be as brief as possible. The first issue is that the IMF's main task is to secure the interests of creditors, external creditors, mainly banks, but also other countries and international financial institutions. So the IMF is concerned mainly with liquidity and solvency at all costs. It has no interest whatsoever in social costs, political costs, and even trade costs. The second problem is that many people in Central and Eastern Europe, having survived the ordeal of communism, regard the IMF as kind of substitute central planner. They think that the IMF breaches their national sovereignty. So there's an issue of national sovereignty, to what extent the IMF can interfere in setting national priorities and preferences. The third issue is that local politicians, many of them corrupt and inept, scapegoat the IMF. They point at the IMF as the culprit when they misallocate economic resources, abscond with funds, or simply implement wrong economic measures. So this is the issue of moral hazard. The IMF gives cover to a corrupt, inept elite in many of these countries. And the fourth and last issue is the elephant in the room. Are the collective policies and prescriptions of the IMF and the World Bank, known as the Washington Consensus, are these collective prescriptions and policies counterproductive or helpful? I have been advisor to a few governments in Central and Eastern Europe, and it is my view, for whatever it's worth, that bottom line, the IMF is counterproductive in its involvement in these countries. Yes, it introduces measures of accountancy, transparency, long-term planning, and so on and so forth. It encourages to some extent the private sector. But on the other hand, the costs associated with implementing the Washington Consensus, the IMF program, are so enormous in the medium and long term that they far outweigh any short-term economic benefits the IMF may bring about.
All right, there's a lot to chew over there. Let me put the last point first then. To you, Piotr, do you think that the Washington Consensus is to blame here? Because we have heard from many other sources that the entire, even from Olivier Blanchard himself writing recently, suggesting that perhaps the whole process of austerity measures that everyone went so hard on initially may perhaps be a little misleading in this context and perhaps even damaging.
It might be the case. I'm not judging that. But what we have to recognize is a sort of separation of powers and separation of roles. How can we talk about sovereignty if you run out of cash? If Romania, in this particular situation, is running out of cash and requires external assistance. If it requires external assistance, it's obvious that the money that are coming to assist Romania are going to be conditional. And the conditionality is, in this case, put forward by IMF and others.
All right, let me stop you there for a moment, Piotr.
What happens is that let me just finish this one point, because it's a very important point that I want to make, is that IMF is not bringing legitimacy. It is the responsibility of the domestic government to bring this legitimacy forward with the population.
All right, let me put that directly back to Sam then. How do you respond?
Well, of course, there's conditionality. The question, I think he missed the point. The question is which conditions? The question is what conditionality? Austerity measures, solvency and liquidity-orientated programs are only one of a whole palette of possibilities. And this option has been consistently chosen by the IMF, invariably in a variety of contexts, in a variety of countries. And I think in total it's counterproductive. The second point is that of moral hazard. I have witnessed time and again in many countries in Central and Eastern Europe and in Africa where I used to work, politicians implementing wrong policies, misallocating resources and absconding with funds, pointing the finger at the IMF, blaming the IMF for later austerity measures they have to implement to rectify what they have done.
And that
so there is a shift of responsibility, and that's what we call moral hazard in economics.
And to a certain extent, let's get back to Adrian in Bucharest, to a certain extent, that's one of the problems of Romania, is the problem of corruption is what is fueling some of the unrest on the streets, isn't it? Has the IMF's conditionality been part of the problem in this whole setup, do you think?
Basically, the IMF in Romania is not perceived as being the one to blame for what's happening in the country. The IMF is perceived to be more like a watchdog over the money that has been lended to Romania. And the fear of corruption is always one of the first words that come up when you speak about the Romanian state. The Romanian state is perceived to be a part of people which are very corrupt, which don't use the resources as they should be, and the IMF basically wants to know what they do with the money. And I don't think that the people out in the streets are protesting against the IMF or the measures that the IMF told the Romanian government to take, but they are protesting against the government, the members of the government and
but isn't that the point? I mean, the people on the streets might not be protesting against the IMF, but isn't the point here that the government is corrupt and taking funds from the IMF one way or another is actually helping that process?
Yes, but I don't think that people that got out on the streets at this moment got out because the government is corrupt. Basically, they saw in the last 3 years the government taking some very harsh measures. Last year, there has been a cut of 25% in the salaries of the people working in the public sector, and an increase of 5% in VAT. People didn't go out on the streets at that moment, which is very surprising to me. Although those were the measures that affect them the most. And now they are going out because I think they say enough is enough,
right,
and we want some change.
All right,
but I don't think that there are enough people there.
Sam, let me ask you to comment on those reflections. Do you agree with that analysis?
Sorry?
Do you agree with that analysis from Adrian Ion?
Well, vehemently no, I do not agree. The austerity measures, people started protesting in the streets of Bucharest and later in other cities against the implementation of the healthcare reform, privatization of certain emergency services. That was one of the conditions and requirements of the IMF in the 2009 agreement. In every repeated report that the IMF issued, including the report in December 2011 and the report in October 2011, the IMF mentions that progress should be made on privatizing healthcare and reforming the tax administration. All the austerity measures implemented since the recession of 2009-10, all of them, without a single exception, have been dictated by the IMF. Now, that is not to say that these measures are entirely wrong, that some of them are not productive, that they should not have been, but they came from the IMF. They emanated from the IMF. People are protesting in the streets against the personality of Băsescu, who is authoritarian and unpleasant and so on and so forth, but they are also protesting against austerity measures and privatization measures and lack of functioning institutions and so on and so forth that are a direct, unequivocal, unambiguous consequence of an agreement signed with the IMF in 2009, period.
All right.
That's as simple as that.
Well, Piotr, you mentioned earlier on a good point in response to Sam, and that is that no one lends money without there being conditions because they want to make sure they get it back. But I want you to respond to Sam's point there that, yes, okay, there should be conditions, but do they necessarily need to be these conditions that have so often been shown to actually harm the people who live in the countries that are being imposed, the conditions are imposed on?
Well, I would put it this way. I share actually most of what has been said, and I don't contradict what has been said before. But what I want to underline is the following. The IMF conditionality is going to be working only if it's done together with the local government, in this case with the Romanian government. If it is the IMF telling the Romanians what to do, it's probably not going to work properly, because nobody knows best how Romania functions than Romanians themselves. Therefore, IMF is not going to be fully successful in protecting its money if it tells what should be done to the local people. But it's not the IMF who are elected people. It is the local governments who are elected. And they hold their responsibility and they hold their legitimacy. And they have to always keep on board the society at large. Therefore, it is their responsibility to convey the messages and to be prepared whenever those discussions, those negotiations happen. And we see that it's never easy. And there's plenty of conflicts everywhere, in Greece, in Romania to a lesser degree, in Hungary, in Italy as well, in Spain obviously. But those tensions are inbuilt. And now it is the responsibility of the political class to make sure that they know what they really want from the IMF, not only the money, but what sort of austerity measures they can take and what sort of austerity measures they cannot take. And they should know it best when they sit together with the IMF.
All right, well, Adrian, let me come to you. You say that the population and presumably the government doesn't blame the IMF for the problems that the country has had. But in a broader sense...
Not entirely, at least.
In a broader sense, though, tell us what the government and the people of Romania think about their membership of the EU. Do they think that being part of this body that right now is fighting for its very life was a good move and will prove to be beneficial for them in the future?
I wouldn't know how to answer to that because I don't think they really have a clear idea. Being member of the EU until now for the Romanians only meant easier access abroad, easier access of goods, but we haven't really been affected like in the way, for example, Greece was by adopting the euro or other measures which were, for example, for Greece or other countries seen as being having a negative impact on the population. So I don't think that Romanians have anything against Romania joining the EU.
All right, but Piotr, very quickly, let me turn the question around to you and ask, from the EU perspective, is there any problem with Romania's membership? I mean, there are so many peripheral countries now who are proving to be a burden on the EU itself. Might Romania be seen in that light at some point?
Well, I guess retrospectively, quite a few people think that 2007 enlargement was premature, if not entire 2004 and 2007 enlargements at all. I don't share that view. Romania is a full-scale member of the European Union. It's not part of the euro area, but it is a member of the European Union with all the rights and obligations. And again, if there are obligations when it comes to the membership in the European Union, it might be that the political class missed that part when discussing the issue with the public at large, only promising the goodies and forgetting about the stakes. They promised, for example, in Romania, the lifting of the border controls, and we see how difficult that is. It's not going to be easy, and it's been what? 5 years now that Romania is in the European Union, and Schengen is still at least a few months away.
We're almost out of time, so I'll put the final question to Sam. Sam, you brought up the issue of the Washington Consensus and criticized it for its effects and its general tenor. So tell us, given in a world where the Washington Consensus still seems to be the driving motive, the driving force of economic policy, where are we going now? Not just in Romania, but in the other European nations where so much problem is going on. How do you read the developments from this point onwards?
I just want to say one thing. Negotiations in the context of talking to the IMF is a euphemism. The IMF dictates. The IMF does not negotiate. Without the imprimatur of the IMF, no country can borrow money in the international markets, country in distress. So these are diktats. They are not negotiations, negotiated agreements. And the local politicians are absolutely helpless and hapless and unable to resist the IMF pressure if they really need the money. If the Washington Consensus is implemented in its full severity throughout the European Union, and I'm talking even about countries such as France and Germany, believe it or not, because they are, in my view, about to enter the crisis full scale, then Europe will be devastated. I have seen the Washington Consensus implemented in another continent, in Africa. I have seen the Washington Consensus implemented in southeastern Europe, in the Balkans. and that's not a sight to behold.
All right.
The Washington Consensus safeguards the banks, not the countries.
A sobering point on which to end this discussion. Thanks very much to all three of our guests. In Bucharest, Adrian Ion; in Brussels, Piotr Kaczynski; and in Skopje, Sam Vaknin. And thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. And if you want to send us any feedback, just email your thoughts to insidestory@aljazeera.net. That's it for now. Until next time, bye-bye.